So could I ask you to warmly welcome Polly to speak to us this afternoon. We'll have the same format, she'll speak, and then we'll have a few moments of questions and comments. In case I forget at the end, anyone involved in the maths group, will you stay behind after this session and gather in the corner for further developments? Welcome, Polly.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to all of you for the invitation to come. I feel very lucky to be here with you this afternoon. So, my job for the next half an hour is to introduce you to some of the activities that corporations are up to at the moment, especially in the world of trade, but most crucially, what we can do about it. The biggest barrier to addressing poverty, inequality and injustice is the thirst of corporations for profit and their rapacious behaviour as they do this around the world. Now let's start maybe with something that we've probably all been involved in one way or another because of the different organisations that you come from. Let's think about aid. I'm sure some of you have campaigned this agreement, which involves over 50 countries all around the world purely focusing on services, and in particular public services and how you can trade them. And for many other countries, particularly around the Pacific, they're engaged in trying to stop a trade deal called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. So there's a whole range of trade deals being negotiated, and they have within them many common features. Probably the thing we're most concerned about is something called Investor-States Dispute Settlement. And I promise you, the reason they have all these names is to put you off the scent and to not look beyond the name at the detail. But we should give it some attention. So Investor-State Dispute Settlement is basically a whole set of laws, new laws, just for corporations so that they can sue governments. And I'm not joking, I wish I was. And they would sue, corporations can sue governments in special courts, international courts, entirely bypassing the domestic legal system, that doesn't matter. And they can do this if those corporations feel that their profits have been reduced because of the actions of governments. Maybe governments have brought in public policies that would have an impact on their profits. And just to give you a sense of what that means in real life, the kind of thing we're talking about is when Veolia, a company probably lots of you know because they come and pick your rubbish up every week or two. Veolia operate in Egypt. The Egyptian government, after all of the turmoil that was going on, decided to raise the minimum wage. Good idea. Veolia sued the Egyptian government because by raising the minimum wage, it would dent Veolia's profits. And so they could take out a case against the government through these special courts with these special laws and sue them, which A, has a cost for the Egyptian government if they lose a case to pay, but it also has this chilling effect to put governments off doing anything, bringing in any public policies that might leave them open to these kind of challenges. Or you've got Vattenfall, a Swedish company. They sued the German government because after the Japanese nuclear disaster in Fukushima, the German government decided it was going to phase out all of its nuclear power. Vattenfall owned and ran the power plants, so they sued the German government for the loss of profits because nuclear power was going to be phased out. So in both these cases you can see that there are clear public policy decisions, actions that democratically elected governments have taken in the interests of the common good that are being overturned through trade agreements. And a few people summed this up in Parliament Square a few months ago. Another thing you find in all of these trade agreements is that they negotiate to lower standards. And this is across the board. It's talked about, the example that the negotiators will use is, well, you know, the kind of thing we're talking about is about seatbelts in cars, because, you know, in the US you measure them like this, and in the EU you measure them like this, and it's just so confusing. If we just sort it out and have the same standard, it'll all be fine. Actually, what they're talking about is lowering standards in areas like food, the environment, in health and safety, because we have a different set of standards. In the EU, very often the standards are higher than in the US. In the area of chemicals, for example, in the US, 1,300 chemicals are deemed to be safe and can be used, and they are banned, all bar 11, across the EU. So the whole TTIP negotiation has been for the US negotiators, well, how do we get to sell our products that use all these banned chemicals in the EU at the moment, get them to be sold in EU markets? So again, that's another very clear example where what is in the common good, what elected governments across the EU have felt was in the public interest, is being challenged and watered down through trade negotiations. And the last common area I really wanted to share with you is about privatisation. Now, for me, public services are probably the epitome, the essence of what is in the public good. You know, we pay for them through our tax system, which is based on how much you earn, and in theory, everybody can access them free at the point of delivery, no matter how much money you've got. But with the trade deals, public services are squarely in the glare of the negotiators, squarely what they want to have access to, a whole untapped market. So in these trade negotiations, at the very basic level, the idea is that you would lock in the status quo of how much is delivered through the public sector and how much is delivered through the private sector. So at the very minimum, you can't change that balance and maybe bring some privatised services back in-house. I mean, maybe you feel that the national rail system doesn't work very well under the private companies and you might want to bring some of those franchises back into the public sector. Well, under these trade negotiations within TTIP, you wouldn't be able to do that, maybe at all or very easily. And that's because if you did that, you would leave yourselves vulnerable to being sued by a company for impacting on their profits and would have to pay them a huge amount of money. So again, this maximisation of profit, the aim of many of these trade deals, works completely contrary to what's in the public interest. Now, I think it's really important to look at where these trade deals come from. It's not an accident that these are the kind of things that are on the negotiating table right now. And I want to take you back beyond the 23rd of June, even further, to the financial crash in 2008. Lots of countries are on the verge of recession. For corporations, they were terrified. How are we going to sustain our profits? And they saw, in the midst of everybody else's pain, an opportunity to make a whole lot of money, because they convinced a number of governments that what you could do would be to negotiate these new trade deals, and that would generate stronger economic growth, which would be good for everybody, but would definitely be good for the companies. And the kind of things that they wanted to negotiate around were not, some innovative new products that they had come up with. No, it was about carving out new markets in whole areas where they weren't allowed to trade before, because they were exactly the things that they were banned from doing because it wasn't safe, or it was something that was in the preserve of the public sector. And I always find it pretty startling when I remind myself of the statistics. In the run-up to the negotiations for the TTIP trade deal being launched, some very interesting analysis was done about who was lobbying the European Commission, who were the main negotiators. And as you can see on this slide, 92% of the 560 meetings that took place were from business lobby groups, because they are smart. They could see an opportunity and they wanted to make sure that they got the kind of deal on the table that was in their interests. Now, I think one thing I find very frustrating about this is that pretty much across the board, most governments accepted the myth that through these trade deals there will be all-round economic growth and the benefits would trickle down to everybody. I mean, I'm sure many of you are under no illusion that the trickle-down theory does not work. Even during the financial crisis, the 300 richest people in the world increased their wealth by 16%, which is pretty disgusting. But let's have a look back to a slightly international perspective and what we know about trickle-down in that area. So in the 80s, it was the surge of free market policies, the surge of neoliberal economics and the kind of policies, the beginning of the policies that we see in trade deals now. But when you look at what happened to Africa from the 1980s to now, you can see a lot of evidence to show that the rich did pretty well, they got richer, but the poorest stayed poor. So in 1981, across Africa, 288 million people were deemed to live in poverty. But by 2008, after the imposition of all of these free market policies, poverty hadn't changed proportionately at all. By then, by 2008, 506 million people still lived below the poverty line, but the proportion hadn't changed at all, even though population had gone up. And you can see it very starkly in contrast between the experience of two countries in the global south, Nigeria and Nepal. Nigeria is the star of the African economy. It has the biggest growth across Africa. Its growth increased by 12 times since 2001. Yet, since 2001, the only impact it had been able to make on poverty was to reduce it by 1%, from 63% of the population to 62% of the population. And you should contrast that with what was happening in Nepal in the same period. So Nepal's had pretty average growth, good probably compared to the UK of just under 4%, but pretty average for many countries in the global south. Yet, they managed to halve the poverty in their population from 53 to 24% of people. So you can see, just because you've got great growth rates does not mean that you're tackling poverty, inequality or injustice. And actually, you can do better and have a better effect on those things without focusing on the highest growth rates at all. So we know growth is not enough, and actually social justice requires us to share the wealth and resources and our planet more widely. But it's a pretty serious challenge for us. How do we get corporations to share? I mean, they don't want to share. You can't get them even to pay their taxes fairly, let alone all the dodging that they do. And what have we seen in the last month? The scandal of Philip Green, Topshop owner, BHS robber, who's, 11,000 people have lost their jobs. 20,000 people will get a lesser pension because he saw a quick scam, a big way to make money, and he was able to get away with it. But secondly, corporations aren't obliged to share. They don't have to do it. Their responsibility is to deliver for their shareholders and to deliver profits. They're entirely within their rights and their law to be focusing on that. That's what they're set up to do. And I think this is why we need to look with very wide eyes at the whole world of corporate social responsibility and voluntary guidelines. They don't work, they're not effective, they're not fit for purpose. At best, they're a distraction, and at worst, they allow corporations to get away with dreadful things. We've been looking at global justice now into a particular aid project called the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. The UK government puts in £600 million of aid into this project, and you would think it would be aimed at tackling food security and nutrition, as in its name. But don't be misled. Actually, this project is really about engaging with big corporate food businesses like Unilever and Coca-Cola, well known for its role on nutrition, engaging with these big corporations to help them get access to African food markets. So it's involved a whole lot of policy changes to make it easier for corporations to acquire land in lucrative African markets, to make it easier for corporations to sell genetically modified seeds, and in fact in some countries like in Ghana to make it illegal to swap and share seeds freely, the ones that you collected from your crops the year before, which is obviously much more sustainable. And also crucially to give those businesses a kind of support to place them centrally within the supply chains of food that's grown in Africa and exported elsewhere, with very serious consequences for small farmers. Now this for me is an example of a scheme which epitomises the problem with our engagement with corporations. So for Unilever, which has probably one of the best corporate social responsibility records, glowing statements on its website, beautiful brochures and some positive work, but at the same time that gives them access to securing aid money that does harm. And in fact, the European Parliament just completed a study looking into the detail of this aid programme, because other European governments are involved as well. And that was their conclusion, that this aid project actually harms small farmers and communities across Africa. So we should think about what we can do. I guess probably many of you, like me, sometimes you hear about what's going on with trade and corporations, and it's so enormous it feels impossible to change. And maybe you want to curl up in a ball and hope someone else will sort it out or the problem will go away. But just like in the age-old stories of good versus evil, if the goodies stop fighting and opt out of the struggle, the baddies win, and we don't want that to happen. So, I love this picture. This was a protest about TTIP just from last October. I don't know how German civil society managed it really. 250,000 people on the streets in Berlin calling on their government to stop negotiating TTIP, just one trade deal. But I find it really inspiring, in fact, that trade, maybe the campaign issue that seems the most complicated and is the hardest to give you those individual personal stories about what the problems are, can have motivated millions of people, in fact, across Europe. 3.5 million European citizens signed a petition calling on the EU to stop negotiating the deal. I mean, they've ignored it, but you know, it's there, 3.5 million people. But that pressure has helped to encourage the negotiators to offer a slightly watered down version of the investor-state dispute settlement process, those laws that allow corporations to sue governments. And there is action taking place on a daily basis across Europe on TTIP and other trade deals. So I think the first thing we can do is draw some inspiration and some energy from the campaigning that's going on in trade and to take part and to support it. And there are lots of different actions that you can do. On Global Justice Now's website, there's a few that you can look at straight away and send an email to your MP or the Prime Minister and ask them to take some specific actions. The second thing I think we can do is to provide some alternatives. We know that it doesn't have to be like this. Trade doesn't have to be done in this way. And you can look across to Latin America. There's a trade agreement there known as ALBA, which translates into English as the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America. And it's a trade agreement between a number of Latin American countries that is based on a spirit of complementarity rather than competitiveness. So one country says, well, we could give you this, could trade this, and the other country says, well, in exchange, we might do this. And it's worked very well for a number of different countries. And it's also been committed to upholding international standards on labour rights and protecting public services and protecting Indigenous communities. So in real life, in another part of the world, there is a very concrete and inspiring example of how you could do trade differently. Many countries, other countries, have actually started pulling out of the trade deals, that all those acronyms I listed to begin with. Uruguay, South Africa, Indonesia and Ecuador have all actively ripped up the deal and walked away and said we don't want to be part of that game anymore. And the kind of things that we want to see written in are more support for small businesses and looking at the role that cooperatives can play. And you can see some of this summed up in something called the Alternative Trade Mandate, which is a great, although quite a rough start to articulating what this will be. And it's a piece of work many organisations are working on at the moment. As we know, the UK is about to begin negotiating all manner of trade deals. It's important we put the alternative there. Thirdly, and I think this is the most important and in some ways the trickiest, we have to find a way to enforce our standards onto corporations and limit their power. I mean, they're brilliant. They've got teams of, top legal minds finding out how to get the loopholes here and there, whether it's on tax or environmental standards. And we have to beat them at their own game. I can't believe they've got all the best minds in those corporations. We've got them in all of our spaces too. And there's some interesting work going on. One thing is through the UN, where there's a treaty to limit the power of corporations that groups across Europe have been involved in, which looks quite interesting, but I'm sure many of you, like me, love the idea of the UN, but in practice it doesn't always deliver. So in case that doesn't work, a number of groups are also trying to draw our experience of holding corporations to account through our own legal system here in the UK, looking at where we've been able to put shareholder pressure on companies, and where we can actually maybe have a mirror image of the rules that allow corporations to sue governments. Because at the moment you can't sue a corporation, you have to hold individuals accountable, the chief executive or whoever, and whether we could have a reverse investor-state dispute settlement, people versus investor dispute settlement maybe. And I think the last thing I wanted to say was about not underestimating the influence and the power that you and the faith organisations that you're engaged in have. Because many of the people who've got engaged in trade issues are often seen to be characterised as the loony lefties. You don't need to take them seriously. It's much harder for people to say that about you. And I'm sure some of you will proudly call yourselves loony lefties anyway, but particularly the people that we most need to influence are those in the centre and on the right of our political system. And you have the most influence with them of any of the campaign groups going. And so there's a special task just waiting for you to grasp and get on with there. We've actually produced this pack, TTIP and Trade Justice, which you can, there's a few copies available on the store, just in the hall behind, but you can order it off our website. But it's got a whole lot of materials in there, particularly aimed at how you might engage faith activists and doing more work on trade and TTIP. So I encourage you to pick that up. And I think, just in closing, I wanted to leave you with some words. Maybe like me, you have a copy of the Desiderata somewhere or other, and but you don't read it all the time. And I was putting this together, and I was thinking, what? There's something rumbling in the back of my mind. And I went and had a look, and this is what I wanted to read you. Because it says, exercise caution in your business affairs, for the world is full of trickery, and don't we know it? But let this not blind you to what virtue there is. Many persons strive for high ideals, and everywhere life is full of heroism. So I hope together that we can build a movement for trade justice.